1-800-313-9443. That, again, is 1-800-313-9443. And before we go on with the show, I want to plug Tom DiLorenzo's new course that he's teaching online that will be starting, I think it's September the 21st. Is that correct, Tom? I think it's...
yes, September 21st. It's a Tuesday. Yeah, we haven't determined a time yet, but it'll be in the evening, after 7.
Now,
Eastern time.
Okay, folks can look this up at Mises.org. It's MISES.org under their subtitle Mises Academy. And the name of this instruction is The Political Economy of War, subheading, What You're Not Supposed to Know About War. And among many things, students will be learning in this course of instruction why capitalism is the very opposite of war and is the instrument of peaceful cooperation, the economic causes of war, and why and how war is the health of the state, which always causes less freedom and prosperity to its citizens. So please go to Mises.org and read about this course of instruction that will be offered via Mises Academy. So please check it out. All right, so Drew, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Well, before the break, you started talking about railroads, and one of the most common complaints about capitalism and free markets is they will not build infrastructure. So before we had, the Union Pacific and before we had government intervention, how did Americans get around? How did the United States always have public roads and waterways?
No, that's one of the early myths about the free rider problem. It really began with Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, who made an argument that the government needed to subsidize the building of roads and canals in his day, and quite a few other people did. But while he was making that argument, there were dozens of private companies that were attracting investors, not only from America, but from Europe as well. And they built thousands of miles of road. They were called turnpikes. A lot of them were pay roads. And so it disproved the idea that you really needed government to build roads and canals. You didn't. But what usually happens is once the private enterprise achieves something like this, governments step in and they tend to monopolize. It's hard for any business to compete with a competitor whose capital and labor are all paid for by the taxpayers. And so the government always tends to step in these successful enterprises and out-compete them with its unfair advantage using tax dollars. But in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, there were many thousands of miles of roads and turnpike and canals built with private funds. In the state of Vermont, there was a railroad. The Mormons built their own railroad, privately funded, for example, and it wasn't really necessary at all, as the free market proved, to have to use tax dollars to build infrastructure.
Well, during the 19th century, there were a lot of business interests that were trying to get the government to build more road projects. So, say with the Union Pacific Railroad was the first transcontinental railroad. Where was this railroad started? Why was it started there? And who were some of the major players behind it going there?
There was a big argument in politics over the propriety of using tax dollars for something like this for many years, because a lot of politicians, understandably, did not trust politicians to spend vast amounts of money like that on something like a railroad. But one of the foremost proponents was Abe Lincoln, of all people. And in some of my writings, I tell the story of how Lincoln himself invested in land in Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1857. And he did so because his friend, Grenville Dodge, who would later become the chief engineer of the government-subsidized railroads, the Transcontinentals, told him that would be a good place for the Transcontinental Railroad to start from the Midwest. And when Lincoln became president, he signed the Pacific Railway Bill in 1862, and it gave him, the president, the right to choose where they would start building the railroad. And he chose Council Bluffs, Iowa. And he must have made a huge killing at that. And all the big shots in the Republican Party especially made a killing. Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman from Pennsylvania, said, I'll vote for this if you promise to use only American steel. And, of course, he was a steel manufacturer. There was a congressman from Massachusetts named Oakes Ames who said, I'll vote for this if you agree to use American-made shovels. And he was a shovel manufacturer. And so there was a whole dynasty of families created, of very wealthy families created by the government-subsidized Transcontinental Railroad, most of which were very well connected politically and were the ones who got these big contracts. And of course, what it ended up doing is since politics determined how the roads were built, they ended up building them very, very inefficiently. According to political criteria, every member of Congress wanted a separate line down to his district or his hometown, whether it was economical or not, and that's what they did. Whereas James J. Hill, who built the private railroad, he was only interested in economic efficiency and serving the customers in the best way possible, and he did exactly that.
Yeah, you started talking about waste there. It was really interesting. I guess with the construction of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads and all these other transcontinental railroads, can we only assume that since they were built with the full faith and credit of the United States government, that they were constructed with the finest quality, with using the best materials possible?
No, if you read my book, How Capitalism Saved America, it was sort of an orgy of inefficiency. The building of the transcontinental railroads, they literally, since they were given a per mile subsidy by the government, they literally did things such as build railroad tracks on top of 10 feet of ice in the Rocky Mountains in the wintertime. And then when the ice melted, the tracks would collapse. But that was all good. It meant they made double the money because they got to build the tracks again. And that was sort of the par for the course in the building of the transcontinentals. And they used the cheapest products because they wanted to build as fast as possible. The faster you built, the faster you collected subsidies from the government. Whereas James J. Hill, the private entrepreneur, without government subsidies, he had to use the best materials and find the straightest route, the most direct route out west, because he had to persuade customers to pay him to ride on his train. And that's what he did. Rather than pandering to politicians to get government money, he had to pander to the customers, to the people along the way, the farmers along the way who would ship their grain and other things off to the West Coast.
Where did James Hill's railroad start and end? It was called the Great Northern Railroad.
The Great Northern, he was from Minnesota, so it started up in that part of the country. And he's a Canadian by birth. His father died when he was 10 years old. He lost an eye. He worked his whole life. He supported his mother and his siblings when he was 11, 12, 13 years old. And he ended up becoming one of America's most famous entrepreneurs. And even it's said that one of the characters in Ayn Rand's famous novel, Atlas Shrugged, is modeled after James J. Hill.
So since James J. Hill was doing so well by himself, earlier you started talking about the Interstate Commerce Commission, and how exactly did the Interstate Commerce Commission and their setting of rates, how did that affect the Great Northern Railroad?
Well, the Interstate Commerce Commission, they did many things. One of the things they did was there were complaints that people who were shipping large volumes on the railroads were getting quantity discounts, which of course is a very common business practice. If I'm going to ship 1 million bushels of wheat, the railroad will give me a good rate on per bushel. It's just common sense for any business person. But the smaller shippers complained about that. They thought it was unfair. So the Interstate Commerce Commission said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll charge everyone the higher rate so that there's no discrimination. And so they didn't cut the rate to anybody, to the smaller shippers. They raised their rates of the people that were getting the quantity discount. So it didn't help them at all. But later on, at the turn of the 20th century, James J. Hill was actually sued. One of the very first, the very first successful federal antitrust lawsuits was against his company, attempting to break it up. And I suspect, I can't prove it, but I always suspected that this was just sort of an act of revenge because he made the government look so bad for so many years by out-competing their government-subsidized railroads.
Yeah, I had another question about James Hill, and that was, you mentioned that he purchased the land along the way. And, how did he finance the railroad without public assistance?
Investors. He had groups of investors who invested in them. After all, America was a better nation until about 1920. That means that foreigners invested more here than Americans invested overseas. And people from all over the world thought that the growing American economy was a good investment, and a railroad, a privately run railroad by a well-known entrepreneur who could ship goods from the Midwest all the way to California and then across the ocean, that was a good thing to get your money behind. And so he didn't have trouble attracting investors to buy land. He paid for rights of way across Indian land with livestock or money or whatever they could trade for. Whereas with the government-subsidized railroads, they socialized the cost of building the railroads by calling the U.S. Army in to essentially kill all the Indians rather than trade with them whenever they ran into the Indians. And that's primarily what the Indian Wars were about. From the end of the Civil War till about 1890.
And I'm going to use this as a shameless opportunity to plug another interview that I have with Dr. DiLorenzo that you can find in our Radio Free Market archives called Stateless But Not Lawless, which covers a lot of the myths of the old American West, where we talk about this particular topic in some great detail. So, Tom, I have a question. Moving forward, we hear in the press from virtually all the mainstream economists that government spending is necessary to end the economic downturn that we're in right now in 2010, and they like to point to the New Deal as evidence of this working. Based on your knowledge of the Great Depression, what effect did stimulus spending and public works spending projects have on the overall economy? Did they fix the problem?
No, it was all bad. It made the Great Depression much worse. Herbert Hoover had a stimulus spending bill, and where the deficit was 13% of the entire GDP, which is twice as big as what Obama's so-called stimulus is as a proportion of the economy. And, of course, that didn't work. We had the Great Depression. And then all the New Deal spending programs, Roosevelt, his administration employed over 10 million people in government make-work jobs, but the unemployment rate was still 14, 15, 17% by the end of the 1930s, whereas the normal unemployment rate at the beginning of the Great Depression was less than 3%. So it obviously didn't work. In fact, whenever government spends money, it has to take it out of the private sector one way or another, taxes, borrowing, or it prints money and creates price inflation. And so it can only harm the private sector of the economy and pump up the government sector. And the claim that the so-called Keynesian economists make, the claim that the government spending got us out of the Great Depression, is they've pretty much given up on saying Roosevelt did that, and they say, well, World War II did it. But consider this, there were about 5.5 million unemployed people in 1940 in America, and the government drafted 11 million. And so it's no surprise that unemployment disappeared in America when we drafted 11 million men and sent them off to war. But the real Great Depression didn't really end until after World War II ended, and the government budget actually was reduced from about 95 billion to 35 billion from 1945 to 1947. That's about a two-thirds reduction in absolute dollars in government spending, and that's what fueled the real recovery from the Great Depression at the end of World War II. Not just the opposite. The big government supporters claim that the exact opposite is true, just like saying night is day and black is white.